Thank you very much, Alison. What I'd like to do, I've got maybe 111 slides, I think, in 50 minutes, which means we're going to race. I felt with a learned audience, with a lot of archaeologists out there, we could maybe broach some subjects without, in a sense, thoroughly covering them, and that will give us maybe more scope for questions afterwards and at drinks beyond that. So in a sense, I'm not aiming to make one argument completely clearly to convince you that what I'm trying to argue is correct, but I want to apply a whole number of, if you like, partial and abbreviated arguments to make the point. And the central point I suppose I want to make is a very conventional, conservative, down-the-line archaeological point, and that is to say this is a cave site in the Yorkshire Dales where we've been excavating recently, and where we may have the first human, direct human material from the Upper Paleolithic. At least Roger Jacobi, before his death, was happy. I was very happy that he saw this material. There's a human tooth at the top, and a couple of little drilled shells, one snipped off and one a drilled periwinkle shell. And that tiny modification to a natural object, which takes it from being a shell to being a bead, is a critical thing to recognise. And I suppose the whole of the drift of the artificial ape is in some ways to counter an argument that's been advanced by people like Richard Dawkins and others, biological reductivists who would wish to see human technology, human material culture, if you like, as some just an extension, a slight extension of biological capacities, whereas I think that it represents a different form of patterning and, in a sense, is to a degree autonomous. The history of technology obviously is one that goes back a long way, from Oldowan chipped stone tools through the symbolic materials of the Upper Paleolithic, particularly in Europe, and obviously is a continuing story which a number of people who are not archaeologists have also written about recently. I'm thinking particularly of Kevin Kelly and of Ray Kurzweil. So it is in a sense part of the duty of a prehistorian to tell the big picture, to see how did we go from that material to this material. And one of the problems that we face, though, as archaeologists, is that only the hard stuff survives, except in very peculiar circumstances. And I think that this is a very difficult theoretical and methodological and orientation challenge for archaeologists. This is a site I work on and have long association with, Hallstatt in Austria. This is a staircase dating from 1344 BC. It's modular, 3 people can walk abreast. It has a variable tread angle. You can set it up wherever you like in the mine at whatever angle, and link units together. And that the level of technology would not, in a sense, be guessed at if it hadn't been sort of preserved 100 feet underground by those salt conditions. It doesn't surprise me, but in its absence, one would be considered irresponsible to infer it. And yet it's the inference of organic materials from the patterning that we find in the lithics, in the hard materials, and indeed in the human skeleton that I want to talk about today. Very occasionally, of course, as you know, we do get organic materials from further back, going back maybe 400,000 years. Biltzingsleben and Schöningen being good examples of pre-modern human wood technology. But as we go back beyond that, then the imprint becomes effectively absent. In the artificial ape, I wanted to trace the whole arc from the very earliest period, from the very earliest chipstone tools, and even before that, through to modern technology, to see how it was that technology took over from physicality, because one of the paradoxes that we have in becoming human is that in order to be efficient users of tools, in order to be innovative, we have to in fact lose much of our biological capacity and replace it with material artifacts as we become a shaved ape, not just a naked ape, but one who has sartorial pretensions. And effectively what we see in humans is certainly a transfer of power from what I would call the natural to the artificial, with an increase in scale and range, so that it's quite clear, as some geneticists have argued recently, that we are now designing the world into which we are bringing our children. Effectively, biological variation is beginning to be constrained by us and indeed designed by us. And the question for me, though, is how is it that the weakest ape, we are physically the weakest ape, how do we get to this position of global technological domination? And the question could be put graphically to say that whatever the common ancestor up there at 1 or 2 o'clock of chimpanzees at just past 12 o'clock and modern humans, anatomically modern humans, at 11 o'clock, is that sequence through the Australopithecines and Paranthropines, the various also-rans, the Havilines and Neanderthals and so on, represents a remarkable increase in brain capacity at a time when the ancestral line leading through to chimpanzees does really very little. And we can see it graphically in a classic juxtaposition of an early hominin skull, very robust on the left, which has this sagittal crest, has large canine teeth. These are obviously missing, but the whole issue here is about muscular power, being able to eat raw food, and the actual muscles which attach to the lower jaw from the sagittal crest do physically constrain what can happen to the brain case. In order to move to the position of Cro-Magnon on the right, we have to lose robusticity. But in doing that, of course, we lose the actual natural ability to chew raw food. Therefore, you need to bring artificial aids in. And the question is, what came first? The traditional explanation is that we biologically evolve, we become smarter and smarter, and we start innovating, we start making things. And my point is that really doesn't add up. There is the other puzzle of why is it that human brains so far outstrip our nearest primate neighbours. You would smell a rat if you saw that a cheetah ran 3 times as fast as a leopard, and yet that's the issue that we have with Homo sapiens, that we have actually moved to a position where we outstrip our closest relatives to such an extent that many people of a fundamentalist religious persuasion are not moved, and have not been moved since the time of Darwin, into believing that we are relatives at all, that we are a different nature of being. Charles Darwin, obviously we cannot avoid, Darwin's explanation for this cranial capacity was that it's to do with sexual selection. Basically, in a nutshell, that ancestral human females found males with large brains sexy, and they bred with them because they were maybe had the potential to be innovative, but certainly that was a form of attraction, just as the peahen found a peacock's tail attractive. And as Darwin said, had there not been the law, what we now call pleiotropy, the law of similar transmission of characteristics down the female and the male side, he said that the brain of the female human would be as vestigial and compared to that of the male as the peahen's tail was to that of the peacock. And indeed he thought that men were slightly smarter. He thought he was slightly smarter than his wife, as his tally of backgammon games over a lifetime playing after supper led him to believe. in the absence of other factors that he managed not to think about. This is the pattern of what we have to explain. I don't know, do I have a little pointer here? Yeah. This is the pattern that we have to explain. This is a log scale at the bottom, 10 million years ago, a million years ago, 100,000 years ago. And this is brain size, just basically in milliliters. Obviously, I haven't actually factored this in for body size. There are various ways of measuring it, of course. But here we have our chimpanzee brain, our common ancestor back here, 6 million years ago, and chimpanzee brains go sort of level pegging, so they're around about 400 milliliters of grey matter in there today. What you can see is this group here are the Australopithecines and Paranthropines, which have a slightly raised intelligence. They're upright walking, but not significantly so. What you can see, though, is after 2 million years ago, is there's this very rapid takeoff, and by about 1.5 million years ago, there are cranial capacities among Homo erectus and Agaster which are falling within the bottom end of the, well, in fact, close to the modern global average, which is rather lower than some of the published figures for Europe alone would show, of just above 1,200 milliliters of brain. So that expansion there is the if you like the critical takeoff point. And if Charles Darwin had asked Emma Wedgwood a little bit more about the idea that women would naturally prefer men with large heads, he might have got a different answer. I don't know whether he ever asked this question, but she spent a lot of her time in childbirth, and one of the most difficult things for Homo sapiens is parturition, is the issue of the cranium going through a pelvis which is designed for upright walking, which is almost a contradiction in terms. And that's one of the things, because it happened, because we have evolved, we are upright walking, we do have large brains, we don't tend to think about the fact that we are asking a creature that is supposed to make its pelvis into the apex of legs to support a vertical spine, i.e. should be as narrow as possible, to be, in a sense, as wide as possible. And so the sexual selection, natural selection argument of Darwin is very, very problematic. It's the last thing, in a sense, that female hominins should have done, would have been to have found large-headed males attractive, because that would mean a very high risk of death. The thing that Darwin didn't factor in, I don't think, enough, and I can't criticise him for this, he was busy doing plenty, was the story of technology, and obviously most of the material wasn't available to him as well. But side by side with biological evolution, there is the evolution of what we call culture or technological civilization. And the story about that material goes back, we could trace it back a long way, but a couple of people, John Tradescant, father and son, who were the original founders of I suppose their collection became part of the Ashmolean Museum when it was bought by Elias Ashmole, collected lots of stuff which they divided into one of two categories. And this goes back to my first slide. They saw that there was a potent difference between things which were just found, which were just natural, like the plants they brought back to garden with, and those things which had been modified, which they called artificials with 2 L's. And they didn't, they had a lot of odd things in their collection that we might quibble with, a piece of wood which they thought was a fragment of the true cross, which might have been entirely natural, and a mermaid's hand which they thought was entirely natural, which we might argue was at least in part artificial. Now, this idea that there are these sets of objects, natural and artificial objects, gives us the idea of material culture. And my argument is that we are an artificial ape, hence the title of my book, that we are actually completed by technology, and that without technology we could not live, that we do not live in nature, we have not lived for a long time in nature, and that we physically are not built to do so. Now, in order to argue against that, I have to argue for that. I have to argue against a line of thought that also goes back to Darwin, which says that there are two sorts of people out in the world. There are, and this is from German 19th century ethnography, there was the argument that there were people who lived close to nature, they lived in nature, they were often known as the Naturvolk, and there were people who were culturally innovative, who had lots of technology, who were responsible for the European Bronze Age, for example, the Aryans of Child and of Cosina, who were Kulturfolk, they were people who were prone to culture. And Darwin prefigures this idea in his encounters with both the Fuegians in South America and with the Australian Aborigines, in which he argues that there is a greater difference between what he calls savage and civilized man than between a wild and a domesticated animal. And he says things which I don't, in fact, wish to repeat in this room. In his notebook, which is why I've put it up there, these are, in a sense, this is the quotidian racism of the time, but certainly Darwin believed that he was not a racist, in a sense, but he felt it was inevitable that people like the Tasmanians would go extinct, and at that point some gradation between the great apes and Caucasian white humanity would have been lost, and therefore his theory would become less plausible. That was one of his worries. He wasn't holding a candle, obviously, for genocide, but he saw those people as living in nature. And so I ended up, surprisingly for me, in the Artificial Ape, looking at the technology of Tasmania, because I began to think, well, if I'm going to argue that we are really dependent upon technology, then how do we understand the very, very quote-unquote primitive technology of the Aboriginal Tasmanians, the people who are supposed to have had the most reduced material culture of any known human group, with only 24 material items. They apparently could not make fire, they were surrounded by rich fisheries, they lived completely naked for the most part in weather that was quite similar to the weather of Britain and even of Scotland. And they had no composite tools. Those tools that they used at the point of manufacture. And effectively, there was obviously in Darwin's time, he didn't meet them. They'd already been exiled. He met Australian Aboriginals, and he effectively took a genetic or a biological view that they were incapable of, if you like, high culture. In a more recent version of this story, Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs and Steel advances a cultural pathology hypothesis, that it's geographical isolation of people like the Fuegians or the Tasmanians that led them to not be able to make fire, for example, or to not wear clothing in a cold climate. Of course, there's the lost means model, because in a sense Diamond, in common with Richard Dawkins and in common with German ethnographers of the 19th century, see culture as an add-on, as a series of traits which can be listed and which can be tracked over time, and which are relatively straightforward, rather like effectively the cultural extensions of human biologies. And these could be seen as either integrated with a particular genome in modern terms, or as Diamond sees it, independent from that genome, but nevertheless a series of sort of countable things that you could gain or lose over time. Richard Dawkins is most closely associated with this idea of this concept of the meme, because he realised when he wrote The Selfish Gene that if he was going to argue that, in a sense, everything is genetics, and that is the strong neo-Darwinist synthesis that it's all genetics, then how do you account for celibate priests, for nuns who choose not to have children, or even people who choose to wear condoms? There are cultural activities which get in the way of reproduction. And Dawkins's most sort of caricatured reaction to this is to say that these are cultural viruses, that they are some sort of corruption that stop people from, in a sense, biologically breeding. It's a very puzzling argument. We don't have time to pull it all apart here, but in the centre of it is that he has to argue that a thing like a condom or a surplice, or indeed a monastery or a nunnery, is a unitary thing. It's an idea that is similar to a gene. He calls it a meme. He doesn't quite know what the nature of memes is. He's contradictory on this, but effectively it is an old 19th century trait list idea that human cultural things are additive units that you can count up, rather like you can count up biological features. And he finally says that the memes, the ideas, live inside human brains in a curious mechanical paradox, which again, mechanical metaphor, not unlike those, in fact, of the 19th century scholar Paley, but we could talk about that as well afterwards. Now, my point as an archaeologist and one who was trained, I think Alison does herself down, by Alison and others, in some ways under the influence, although he was dead by then, of David Clarke, is to see that the way that material technology, material culture alters and is patterned is far more complex than the way that biological entities are patterned. And that the key thing about our material culture is that it is impossible, in fact, to point at single sufficient and necessary characteristics to define, for example, something as a car. You can find a sufficient and necessary characteristic to define a chimpanzee or a giraffe or a wallflower or a coconut, but biological entities fall into relatively neat categories known as monothetic categories, whereas archaeological entities are much more fuzzy-edged. They tend to be sets of material in which no one feature is at once sufficient and necessary for group membership. Now I'm going to move over this quite quickly because some of you may be familiar with this, and if you're not familiar with it, then in a way it doesn't matter. Fuzzy-edged is the key thing. Should a car have 3 wheels or 4? If it's got 4, is it a car? Well, clearly neither is the case. Cars are what we choose to call them. And that isn't a trivial point. It means that the way that technology evolves, the way that technologists influence one another and things via people influence other things, is a stage more complex. It's ratcheted up into a different world of patterning to the patterning we see in the biological world. So effectively you can't, and this was David Clarke's great point, you couldn't use the processes of biological taxonomy for doing archaeological typology, much though we would like to do so, and often though we approximate that process. Ultimately you can't do it. It doesn't work. A Gundlingen sword is not a genetic idea. So you often, often people put these ideas together and see, on the one side our biological development, and on the right side there is from the Encyclopaedia Britannica 1948, and curiously it's an image which Kevin Kelly has recently chosen in his History of Technology and reproduced without demur. But in fact the one on the right involves far more abstract decisions on the part of the analyst than the one on the left, for all the one on the left's approximations and guesswork. Helmets, effectively, we can see that there are similarities between biological and cultural evolution, but neither the drivers nor the logic of development need be shared. Military helmets are not known to breed with one another, and that is not, I hope, a trivial point. So one of the conclusions I made in the Artificial Ape, which actually I think to date the one bad review I've had, or the one grumpy review from Stephen Mython, and Steve, I want to take you out for a pint and tell you where you've gone wrong with this, is that he said he basically thought that my argument about memes and the structure of artifact typology was irrelevant to what I'm trying to say, but in fact it isn't, because centrally to the argument I'm making is that there are three types of system in the universe that we perceive at least. That there are physical systems, things like gravity, obviously doesn't compete in Darwinian terms, and then there are animate systems, all of which are happily Darwinian, that's fine. And then there are material culture systems, which are the artificial generation of variance among polythetic entities. And in fact, one of the critical differences between the material culture systems and the animate systems is that the material culture systems are teleological, they're goal-oriented. That's the whole point of designing the future genetically, is we're actually deciding what to design, which makes it very different from Darwinian evolution. So let's come back to the Tasmanians, having loosened ourselves up with the issue of traits and memes and what material culture actually is. We weren't, I don't think the 19th century saw the clash of a Kulturvolk with a Naturvolk. When the Beagle arrived in Hobart, it was coming to a country which was simply not used to something which we might call entailed technology. You remember the motor car we saw, 19th century Victorian technology. It's full of whole chains of supplies, multi-part tools like the Beagle itself, whereas the Tasmanians were using technology, but they were using technology in a polar opposite way. The style was different. They were using what's called an expedient technology. So whereas in Europe, as we can see in the famous slide of Leroy Gorin on the left, with his development of the efficiency of getting blade edge out of a kilogram of flint, compared to the effectively Alderwan technology of the Tasmanians on the right. But that's because their stone tool was not the same as an Alderwan stone tool. It wasn't used in the same way. It didn't have the same status and role within their society. I won't, in a sense, go over that, but this connects back in a way to polythetics. To understand their tools, to misunderstand their tools, is to degrade their culture and not see that in fact the whole thing is all of a piece. In fact, I would argue that in fact their material culture use was highly refined, because they boiled it down to the 24 objects they absolutely had to have, and everybody could make them, and they could make them at the point of use. So it actually becomes sensible not to bother making fire, just as it's sensible for me not to bother digging a well if I run out of water. In fact, it's sensible for me not to try to make fire when I want to put the light on. So the Tasmanians had things organised in a minimalist but highly flexible and highly sustainable way, a very sophisticated culture which I don't believe had lost anything, but had chosen to do without certain things because they were deemed to be unnecessary. Their material culture attributes were these 24 items I've mentioned, and I want to now focus on a couple of these, but more particularly the last. Fire, I suppose, is the most famous. They kept fire with them all the time because they didn't have clothing, therefore they weren't going to set their clothing on fire, and they wanted to keep warm, so that was something that they always had. And fire is indeed one of the technologies that had to be there before we became human. The argument's been made very well by Richard Wrangham in Harvard in 2009, the year before my book came out, in his book Catching Fire, in which he argues that you cannot have an upright walking a hominin, a biped, with a consequently shortened gut, and with our sort of brain size, without adding energy to food through fire. Therefore, cooking, whether that is material which has been found burnt after a bushfire, or whether you are curating fire, or whether you're finally able to make fire yourself, is a crucial technology in our biological development. And I won't go into that argument, but it's been made by Wrangham and by John Gowlett, and I think is a persuasive argument. I want to look at another piece of technology, a more material piece of technology, which is the most ubiquitous piece of technology in any world culture, and that is the baby carrying technology. Slings, papooses, waistbands are known wherever there are humans. And the reason that, well, to understand why the Tasmanians, for example, made baby-carrying slings out of the skin of the forester's kangaroo, we need to understand a little bit about what happens as we stood upright. In chimpanzees and gorillas, childbirth is really quite straightforward. In fact, if you look at the pelvises of these animals, you, in a sense, on natural selection terms, would say it would be much more likely, they don't give birth like this, it would be much more likely for encephalization, for large brainness to emerge among knuckle-walking primates than among bipedal primates. Because the way that the child sits, and I've already alluded to this, in the pelvis in humans is very, very difficult. There are a whole series of biomechanical issues which have to be overcome, and many compromises. So that one of the central arguments I make in the book is that actually encephalization, the growth of large brains, should have been ruled out on prima facie grounds when we started to stand upright, because the pelvis is so profoundly narrowed. And in fact, when you grade the material out, that is what happens for quite a long time, because upright walking begins around about 4.8 million years ago, and for the first 3 million years after that, brain size is effectively locked down. It doesn't expand, which is in fact what you'd predict. You would predict that it never would. What we see instead are other things going on. So in Ardipithecus ramidus we see hands with opposable thumbs, which are probably almost as dexterous as ours, or as dexterous as ours, at 4.8 million years ago, but without any particular brain size increase over that of chimpanzees. We know that upright walking is going on because we have the famous Lucy skeleton, for example, and the Lytely footprints. And we've got, sadly, we don't have enough pelvies. When I was writing the Prehistory of Sex, we had the Lucy one. There's now an Australopithecus, there's now a Homo erectus one from Gona in Ethiopia. But in fact, I should cut this, in a sense, cut to the chase here. You'll be able to see as we move from Lucy via Homo erectus to Homo sapiens that actually the cranial size at birth in modern humans and in Homo erectus is not that much more. You win a little bit through a rotational birth pattern through the modern human pelvis, and that's a long and complicated story in itself. But the thing that we actually have to take on board is that the way we became large-brained was not by expanding the size of the brain at birth. If we go back to Down House, all the Victorian shawls and perambulators and nurseries and cots and nurses that surrounded the Darwin children were there because human children at birth are completely useless compared to chimpanzee children. They are born effectively as fetuses. We show, in fact, the highest degree of what's known as ontogenic retardation or paedomorphism of any of the primates. The brain of our children goes on growing after birth to reach the capacities that characterize anatomically modern sapiens. And the flip side of that coin is that we give birth to effectively completely hopeless young. So we've now in a way got another paradox, because if we're giving birth to hopeless young and we're also walking upright, we're also hairless, they can't grip onto us, they can't stagger around. These are my own children. They've kindly allowed me, even though they are 16 and 20 nowadays, to be shown in days when I still had some hair in a couple of the contemporary sling carrying solutions. They're basically growing their heads in a cultural environment, but they can hardly hold them upright themselves. So you can see where this is leading. I'm arguing, in a sense, that we have to find a solution for looking after very, very helpless children before we can begin to develop this evolution of ontogenic retardation. Now, this brings us back to stone tools and material that came out after the Artificial Ape. In summer 2010, Tim White at Dakika has got a site where there is a butchery by Australopithecines using found stones, using basically rocks, to butcher ungulate bones to get meat. And so we can see now Australopithecines using tools, but using tools like chimpanzees use tools in order to enhance their diet. This is before the brain size takeoff. So found objects, broken sharp stones, were perfectly good, it seems, for a good million years before the first chipped stone tools. That actually begs the question then, why at 2.6 million years ago do we begin to get chipped stone tools? If those are not needed, in a sense, for the simple basics of butchery, what could they be for? And my argument, going right back to the slide of the Hallstatt staircase and the concept of entailment, is that the creation of a more controlled blade angle is there in order to process other materials to make other tools. Already the concept of the other tool lies behind this, because these have been hit by another tool in order to make them. And I'm simply arguing that then, having made them, they are to modify a third material beyond that. And that if this is indeed one of the reasons that the Aboriginal Tasmanians chipped their shapes. It was to make other things, such as their kelp water carriers, to cut plant materials, and to process animal skins into things like baby carrying slings. So my argument is that the extraordinary takeoff that we see here, which is 2 million years ago, so let's see, here we've got Tim White's new evidence coming in for more meat in the diet, but using found objects. At 2.6 million years ago we begin to get chipped stone tools, and then around 2 million years ago we get this extraordinary takeoff. Well, the issue for an Australopithecine female walking on the savannah of carrying a child has recently been measured by Karen Stoidel numbers and co-workers in the States as actually greater than the energy cost of lactation itself. So irrespective of anything else, the adaptive advantage and consequent physiological pressure on Australopithecine females to come up with some form of a solution to not have to put both their arms round the baby's bum would have been absolutely immense. I'm arguing that they made that transition because the energy equations tell us that they must have had a way of doing it. And if you solve that carrying problem, and it's not beyond the cognitive capacity possibly even of a chimpanzee to solve that problem. Chimpanzees use bags if you introduce them to them, and a piece of animal viscera in a loop doesn't need to be tied. You can take a midsection out of animal gut and you can loop it and you can park the baby's bum in it. If you can do that, then it begins not to matter how floppy its head is, how ontogenically retarded it is. You break the glass ceiling and you allow selection on slow maturation to take place. Then you can begin to select for intelligence, because you can begin to say it doesn't matter if you're carrying it for a week, a month, or as we do, a year, 2 years, and so on. So anatomically modern sapiens can be seen essentially as a marsupial primate, but only with the aid of technology. We're completed by a technology that allows us to sustain that level of infantile helplessness. And in that sense, we could turn the "we got intelligent and then we became inventive" thing on its head, which is what I've tried to do in the book, and actually say that the technology is something which emerges partly serendipitously, partly to do with lots of interaction with things by dexterous hominins, dexterous but small-brained hominins, and out of that we create a rain shadow into which our biological development can, in a sense, unfold. Sorry, that's a mixed metaphor. So this story obviously continues because we know that evolution in humans is now going on at a faster rate than it's ever gone on epidemiologically in the world today. One thing that in fact we know is going on is numbers of twins are going up, for example, because we don't practice infanticide anymore. Eyesight is getting progressively worse across the world because we basically use technology to catch to compensate for deficits. I wouldn't have had children as a hunter-gatherer. I'm astigmatic. I was born astigmatic. I wouldn't have been able to kill anything. I wouldn't have passed my dodgy eye genes on, but I'm living insulated by civilization, very able to do it. I'm arguing for the opposite of Mary Stopes, actually. I think it's the great joy that, of course, I actually see a lot better than a hunter-gatherer in a way, because through the web of technology I can see meteorites, I can see microbes, one can see plague viruses and asteroids and so on, because we in a sense the biological is no longer anywhere near as important. I think I have nearly 10 minutes, but I'm going to. I realise that I've trundled at a cracking pace through a series of ideas, and I want to just speed up in the last few slides to just give a suggestion of only, I think, in the time of what I think happens after we become symbolic. There is a speeding up of technology from the last ice age. Materials, this is a part of an ivory marionette, mammoth ivory marionette from Brno in the Czech Republic, excavated in 1880, which dates to about 25,000 years ago, a little over. And the technological trajectories, I suppose one of the arguments I want to make is how technology has its own motor, has its own, this is my anti-meme bit really, is that technology goes off in all sorts of different directions. So if we begin with an ivory spheroid, we can see there's a technological trajectory through to ivory game balls in China, or the sort of ivory billiard balls that Charles Darwin played with in Down House. And you then get a demand for a particular artefact, and in fact when Darwin was playing billiards in Down House, the African elephant population was in what appeared to be terminal decline because the game was so popular, and therefore there was a big drive to produce unstable plastic versions, skeuomorphs, which then became more refined, and in fact so synthetics in a sense was born out of that, and indeed then the material tokens by which Watson and Crick began to uncover the very designs of life itself. And at the same time, balls as ball bearings in Asimov's walking robot bring us to a point where we've actually got bipedalism going on that is completely designed by us. They can now run around on their own. And all of that technology is quite unexpected. A lot of it was not planned. It is part of its own very complicated dynamic. So all of those things, ball bearings, robots, DNA, all come together in the way we project a future where we are blurring the distinction between biology and technology. And that's a complicated story. But I wanted to, I probably don't have time to go into this, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what is done to our minds by symbolic culture, and I don't have time to do that. I'm just going to show one or two slides of this Brno marionette as it might be reconstructed. Because what happens with symbolic culture, of course, is that we create a world in which children are born and they observe the way in which the material world around them functions. And from that they don't just learn lessons, but their brains, which are incredibly labile, as I've said, because of this ontogenic retardation, because they are fetuses, they are completed within a cultural environment. That is, ideas are brought into play that nobody planned on bringing into play, which become embedded and naturalised in the generation that grows up with them. Susan Greenfield's been talking about this quite a lot recently in quite negative terms and quite interesting terms about the way in which screen culture and the demise of books is affecting the actual physical wiring of our children's brains as the technology moves forward, and it's a very interesting debate. The person I'm turning to now, and I suppose this goes beyond what I was saying in the Artificial Ape, I'm becoming increasingly interested in the work of Lev Vygotsky, who didn't live for very long but was a child psychologist in the Soviet Union in the early days of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, and his work is being increasingly, which was hardly published at the time, is being increasingly looked at. It stands next to Muriel Montessori's and Piaget's as a very interesting, a brilliant analysis of the idea of the zone of proximal development, the way, the space into which the child's mind works, which is a physical and material space in which things actually adumbrate ideas, which then develop into the forms of thinking that will characterize the rest of their lives. So, effectively, many of the things that we see as natural, growing up in a culture, ways of thinking even, are in fact conditioned by the material extensions that we have inherited from the past. So very finally, as we're 5-2, I just want to point out what is the implication. The symbolic revolution is here at 30,000 years ago, and that is quite interesting. We don't have enough data points yet, but I would like to suggest at least that these are the Neanderthals here, and you probably know that both among the Neanderthals and among some late archaic Homo sapiens, there is some very, very large recorded brain capacities. They're very big brains, very big heads. And there is certainly a decline in the last 30,000 years. There's a decline in physical robusticity, immeasurably, in the last 10,000 years. And anatomists like Chris Ruff and others are quite convinced that that is to do with the insulating effect of the environment, that we don't need to be as robust, we don't need to be as tough as we did 10,000 years ago or 30,000 years ago. And I suggest that also maybe we don't need to be as intelligent, not in a biological sense. The Neanderthals maybe actually had to remember an awful lot more. They had to internalise, know more languages, be able to count in a more unaided way, because they didn't have the sorts of machines that I have got. They didn't have mnemonics, they didn't have symbolic culture, they didn't have that tiny drilled periwinkle shell that allowed you to remember the presence of somebody who had gone. In the executive summary then, last couple of slides, I would argue that our cranial expansion should be viewed as preceded by cultural innovations such as cooking, use of edge tools, and the emergence of carrying technology, especially the baby sling. That the continuing reverberation of what Sartre called the practico-inert, the physical world, brings humans into being as cultural artefacts. And it's also enabled what I would call our counter-natural biology to emerge. And then, in a sense, the thing that I adhere to most as a theoretician, our materiality theory, it goes under various titles, developed by J.J. Gibson and others, looks at the affordances, the things that artefacts allow you to do, and bodies, as in intimate connection. We are extended through things, and things extend back through us. So our enculturation is actually physically structured, not just externally, but internally as well. Thank you very much.